There are moments when the silence of your prayers becomes louder than your words. When your voice trembles, not because you're tired, but because your heart is breaking under the weight of unanswered du'as. You've been waiting, years maybe, holding your hands to the sky with tears soaking your palms, asking for relief, for healing, for a breakthrough. But the door seems closed, and you're left wondering, does Allah hear me? Did He forget me? Or worse, am I not worthy of His mercy? But what if the problem isn't that your dua was ignored? What if you never truly understood who you were calling upon? This is not just a reminder about dua. This is a story of rediscovery, a journey back to the one whose names hold the very power to rewrite your reality. The Most Merciful, the All-Powerful, the Most Wise. This is not about getting what you want. It's about finally understanding who you're speaking to and what that means for your soul. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of traffic outside. Ahmed sat cross-legged on the thin prayer mat he had owned since university, a mat worn not by time but by tears. His hands were raised, palms open, the lines of his fingers trembling faintly in the dim light. This was his nightly ritual. After the world shut down, when even the moon seemed too exhausted to shine, he would come here, to this little corner of his apartment, seeking something he could not name. He didn't cry anymore, not tonight. His tears had dried up long ago, leaving behind only a hollow kind of ache that no longer needed expression. He had prayed for years, quietly, sincerely, relentlessly. At first he prayed with hope, then with urgency, and eventually with something more desperate, like a drowning man gasping for air that never came. Each night he would whisper the same broken words, "Ya Allah, please, I need you." But nothing ever changed. His debts remained. The job offers never came. The person he loved married someone else. Loneliness built walls around his heart, and silence became his closest friend. People told him to have sabr, to be patient, to trust Allah. And he did. Or at least he thought he did. But what do you do when even your patience begins to feel like punishment? He started to wonder if perhaps he was forgotten, not in a rebellious or angry way, but in that quiet, aching way where your soul begins to fade under the weight of your unanswered cries. He began to question, not Allah, but himself. Was he sinful? Unworthy? Had he lost something sacred along the way? It wasn't that he stopped believing, he just stopped expecting. And yet, even in that emptiness, he kept showing up. Every night, every single night. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the fatigue and frustration, there was still a flicker of something he couldn't extinguish. A stubborn whisper that said, "Keep asking." Someone is still listening. It was on one of those nights after praying Isha alone that Ahmed came across a short video online. A lecture, simple, nothing flashy, about the names of Allah. He clicked on it without much thought, but what he heard in those next few minutes cracked open something inside him that had long been sealed shut. The speaker began to talk about how we make dua without truly knowing the one we are speaking to, how we plead for mercy without understanding Al-Rahman, for miracles without trusting Al-Qadeer, and for answers without surrendering to Al-Hakeem. These weren't just names. They were divine attributes, doorways to knowing Allah, not just as a distant Lord, but as the closest presence in our pain. Ahmed paused the video, heart racing. He realized something that night. He had been calling on Allah as a stranger would call into the dark, not as a beloved would cry to their guardian. His duas were technically correct, but spiritually detached. He asked for help, but he didn't invoke the one whose mercy never ends. He begged for change, but forgot the one whose power writes all stories. He demanded answers, but never considered the wisdom behind the silence. He restarted his prayer, this time not with routine, but with revelation. His voice shook, but not with fear, with awe. Ya Rahman, you've always been with me. I just didn't see you. That night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not fulfillment, but intimacy. The kind of intimacy that comes when your soul finally turns around and sees the one who never left. Dua, the weapon of the believer. That phrase began to haunt Ahmed in the best way. He had heard it before, recited it without thinking, but now it pulsed with new life. If dua was a weapon, he had been holding it backwards. Or worse, he had been wielding it with numb hands, not knowing its power or purpose. He began to reflect. Why do we wait until we are crushed before we start asking sincerely? Why do we spend hours worrying, researching, talking to others, and only in the end, almost as an afterthought, we say, maybe I should make dua, as if it's a backup plan instead of our primary shield? He realized how many people treat dua like an emergency button, break in case of failure. But dua was never meant to be the last act. It was meant to be the first, the central, the most potent. The lifeline we hold not when we're drowning, but before we even step into the storm. He remembered the words of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Dua is worship, not part of worship. It is worship. And suddenly, Ahmed saw it not as a request, but as a relationship. A conversation with the one who wants to be spoken to, who loves to be asked, who responds, not always with the answer we want, but with something deeper, presence. So he began again. Each night he would sit in his room, raise his hands, but now not just with problems, with praise, with names. He didn't just say, help me. He said, Ya Rahman, help me through your mercy. He didn't just say, fix this. He said, Ya Al-Qadeer, nothing is impossible for you. He didn't just say, why me? He said, Ya Al-Hakeem, I trust that you know what I do not. Al-Rahman, the most merciful, not just to the believers, to everyone. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of relief was proof of this mercy. Ahmed saw it in places he hadn't before. In the warm coffee given by a stranger, in the sun that still rose despite his sadness, in the fact that his heart still beat, even when he no longer wanted it to. That's what mercy looks like, unconditional, unseen, unrelenting. He began to notice how Al-Rahman gives to those who disbelieve, how he sustains even the wicked. If that's how he treats those who deny him, what about those who cry to him with broken hearts? Ahmed found his soul melting under this realization. He had once thought Allah had turned away from him, but now he saw it was his eyes that had turned. His Lord had never moved, and so he called upon him, not as a stranger, but as a servant who finally understood who his master was. He realized something else too. Al-Rahman doesn't need a reason to give. His mercy isn't earned, it's simply there, waiting, overflowing, ready to pour over anyone who turns to him. And Ahmed, he was finally turning, heart, soul, and all. The rain was soft that morning, brushing the windows with gentle fingers as if nature itself had grown tender. Ahmed woke not to the sound of his alarm, but to the stillness, that kind of rare silence that feels sacred. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the heaviness of dread pressing into his chest. Not because his problems had disappeared, they hadn't. The job rejections were still unanswered. His debts still loomed like storm clouds, and the loneliness still came like waves. But something inside him had changed. And it wasn't a small change. It was the kind that rewires how you breathe, how you see, how you even talk to yourself when no one's around. He sat up, stretched, and for a moment just listened to the rain. Then he whispered, "Ya Latif," and smiled. The name had found a home in his chest lately, growing roots where anxiety once lived. It meant the subtle, the gentle, the one who works in hidden ways. And Ahmed had begun to see just how subtle Allah's workings really were. It wasn't that life had suddenly turned in his favor, but that his eyes had been opened to a deeper narrative. There was a time he would have seen delays as denials. Now he saw them as a rearrangement, a divine recalibration. Things were not falling apart, they were falling into place, just not in ways he understood yet. He remembered something from the Quran that had always puzzled him until recently, the story of Prophet Musa and Khidir, how Khidir damaged a boat, killed a young boy, and rebuilt a wall for a people who had shown no hospitality. Each act seemed cruel, unfair, until the wisdom behind them was revealed. That's how Al-Latif moves, unseen, unfelt, but always purposeful, always for your good, even if it doesn't look that way on the surface. Ahmed began to look back at moments he once cursed. The job he didn't get, it would have placed him in a toxic work environment he later discovered through a friend. The girl he lost? She entered a marriage that ended in deep sadness, and he was spared from being part of it. The friend who betrayed him. That betrayal pushed him toward the solitude that gave birth to his healing. None of these things made sense while they were happening, but with time the veil had been lifted just enough to glimpse the mercy behind the pain. He now started his du'as not with complaints but with gratitude. Thank you, Allah, for the no's, because every no was a secret yes wrapped in your wisdom. And the more he reflected, the more his heart softened toward the delays, the silence, and the wait. Because maybe the wait itself was the answer. Maybe Allah wasn't preparing the situation. Maybe He was preparing him. There are things you can only learn in the wait: humility, resilience, sincerity. And maybe, just maybe, the person Ahmed was when he first made those du'as wasn't ready for the answer. But the man he was becoming, he was, slowly, steadily, gently. He once feared that du'a was a shout into a void. Now he knew it was an invitation to a relationship, not just with Allah, but with himself, his truest self, the self that didn't rely on outcomes but on presence, the self that knew Allah was always near, always crafting something sacred, even when life felt like shattered glass. It was in this space of quiet trust that Ahmed began to understand another name, Al-Mujib, the one who responds. The name had always been there, but he had misunderstood it. He used to think a response meant getting what he asked for, a job, a healing, a spouse. But now he saw that the first response was always deeper, a shift in the heart, a transformation in the soul. One night during Tahajjud, he found himself whispering to Allah, not asking but reflecting. Ya Mujib, you answered me before I even knew how to ask properly. You gave me closeness instead of comfort. You gave me clarity instead of control. You gave me you. And that was the greatest answer of all. He felt it in his bones, that the real response was never in the material things he craved, but in the nearness he had gained. It was Allah's way of saying, I heard you all along, but what I wanted for you was better than what you asked of me. The doors that hadn't opened began to feel less like rejections and more like divine redirections. He started to see his life not as a series of failures, but as a map. Each no, each delay, each moment of silence was a point leading him closer to something greater than he could imagine. Sometimes Allah didn't change the situation because he was using the situation to change him. There were still hard days. Of course there were. Days when he doubted, when he cried, when he felt the old ache resurface. But now he had tools, not worldly ones, spiritual ones. He would turn to Al-Halim, the most forbearing, and remind himself that Allah wasn't angry with him just because he struggled. He would turn to As-Sabur, the most patient, and find peace in knowing that if Allah was patient with him, he could be patient with Allah's plan. And then came the day that shifted everything. It wasn't dramatic, no lightning bolt from the sky, just an email, a job offer, one he hadn't even applied for directly, referred by someone he had helped months ago without expecting anything in return. It was the kind of job that didn't just pay the bills, it aligned with his passion. It felt surreal, like an echo of all the du'as he once whispered in the dark. He sat there, email open, heart racing. He didn't cry out of joy, he cried out of remembrance, of all those nights he thought he was forgotten, of all those moments he nearly gave up. And here in the quiet clicking of an email, Allah had written a different ending, but the greatest miracle wasn't the job. It was that, even if this had never come, Ahmed would have been okay, because he had already found what he truly needed, a relationship with the one who never left his side, a certainty that dua is never wasted, never unheard, never in vain. So he kept praying, not because he needed something new, but because dua had become his anchor, his home, his proof that Allah listens, responds, and most of all, loves. And maybe that's what dua was meant to teach all along. Not that we are in control, but that we are always, always in the care of the one who is.